Hey people, this is my review of The Avengers and the first part of my superhero movie battle of 2012 video series. For those of you who don't know, I'm doing reviews for all three of the major superhero movies coming out this year, and then when it's all said and done, I'm going to compare the box office results, critical reception, and declare a winner. But for now, let's get into The Avengers. As a fan reviewer, I like to take a different angle than most people because I try to go in depth and focus on the areas that I think might be improved based on my knowledge of the source material. With the Avengers, I ran into trouble there simply because there was really so little that I could find fault with. Even with all the reading I've done of the Avengers comic books and episodes I've watched of the animated series in the 4 years that I've been looking forward to this movie, there's really very little I can look at with the Avengers and make a suggestion about how it could be improved. I think that has a lot to do with finding a talented writer and director like Joss Whedon, who's also a big fan of the comic books. I've read and heard from many sources that the movie manages to give each Avenger a good amount of screen time so that it really feels like an ensemble instead of Iron Man and his amazing friends. Even with my expectations raised by these claims, I was impressed by the extent to which it was true. Things aren't exactly equally divided out. Thor fans probably won't be as satisfied as Captain America or Iron Man fans. However, every character has a purpose and feels like their presence is worthwhile. Steve and Tony probably have the most screen time of the Avengers, and they're both pretty well developed, partly by how they're influenced by each other. Tony is still the same character we've grown accustomed to, but Steve has changed a little bit. He seems older and more mature than the kid from Brooklyn we met in his solo film. Steve is struggling to find his place in the world. Tony Stark serves as the embodiment of this flashy, modern world, so he provides both a target for Steve's frustration and someone to prove himself against. Tony belittles Steve and makes him feel inadequate. Since Howard Stark had a great deal of respect for Steve, Tony likely wants to prove himself against Steve, so he can imagine his father would feel the same way about Iron Man that he felt about Captain America. There's a struggle for dominance, but in the end, both find a leadership role within the team. Thor is the last Avenger introduced in this movie, and once he arrives, we're already pretty deep into the story, so there wasn't that much time to devote to him. As could be expected, Thor's main story is focused on his relationship with Loki. Thor understands that Loki's dangerous, but he still loves him as a brother, so he wants to reason with him. I would have liked to see a little more of focus on Thor's internal struggle, but he still was given his moments in the spotlight. Tom Hiddleston's Loki, who was established as a pretty complex villain in Thor, is much more menacing this time around. While Loki has always been an intelligent schemer, in the Avengers he's much more dangerous and a force to be reckoned with. Like many people, I was concerned about Hawkeye since he's had the least amount of time on screen prior to this movie. Since he is relatively low on most people's priority list of characters to see, it's easy to imagine the studio throwing him in there with no purpose other than to please fans and add to the team's numbers without really driving up the cost of special effects. While his backstory is the least developed, and we weren't really able to get as much of a feel for his personality as some of the others, he was definitely an appealing character that I hope to see more of. From what we do find out about Hawkeye here, it's clear that he's quite different from the classic version of the character. In the comics, Clint Barton was a criminal who became a hero, but kept his rebellious spirit. From what I've read, I believe his loose cannon personality often brought him into conflict with Captain America. In the Avengers, Clint is a much more disciplined agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. There's no conflict whatsoever between him and Steve Rogers, which makes sense. Steve already has his rivalry with Tony Stark, which has a much more interesting dynamic to it given their connection through Tony's father. Anyway, when it comes down to it, I think non-fans who doubted that Hawkeye would be cool enough to be on the team will probably be eating their words. Black Widow's backstory was given a surprising amount of attention here. While not everything was revealed about her history, we definitely learn a lot more about her and feel like we know her much better by the end of this movie. Most importantly, we find out where her sense of duty and responsibility come from. Bruce Banner feels like a pretty different character this time, and it's not just because of the transition from Edward Norton to Mark Ruffalo. Banner's intellect is center stage, but there's also a greater sense of darkness in regards to his condition. When we last saw him, he was actively pursuing a cure for his condition. Now he seems to have accepted what has become of his life. There's a definite sense of pain in Ruffalo's performance, but Banner isn't just some moping, useless loser. He seems to want to make the most out of his situation. Meanwhile, the Hulk has much more of a personality in this movie. It seems that with time the Hulk has grown more intelligent so that he's not just a wild beast reacting to what happens around him. This time the Hulk seems to enjoy himself, and because of that, he's even more fun to watch. While part of me still wishes that Edward Norton could have reprised his role in order to give things a better sense of continuity, it's hard to be disappointed with the performance Mark Ruffalo gave as Bruce Banner in the Hulk. Nick Fury still isn't really the character we know from the main Marvel comic universe. However, Samuel L. Jackson finally manages to seem commanding enough to be the man in charge of an organization as huge as S.H.I.E.L.D., while not letting this role become a loudmouth caricature of himself. Nick Fury definitely has a heart and cares about people, playing a vaguely parental role to the Avengers. Clark Gregg is more likable than ever as Agent Coulson. While still the by-the-book character we met in Iron Man, Coulson has grown more entertaining and quietly funny in every appearance since then. Cobie Smulders seems like a suitable addition to the Marvel Cinematic Universe as Maria Hill. Her role is somewhat small in comparison to the Avengers and the other main characters, so we don't really get to know her very well, but I'm sure Marvel has planned for her. It would be ridiculous to expect this movie to give each character the kind of development that a solo film can. In spite of this, fans should be satisfied by the quality of the characters' stories, as well as the actors' performances. While I can understand if some fans would have preferred this to be more of a character exploration in the vein of Watchmen, I feel like the amount of character work done and the quality of that work suited the film well. The Avengers tell some small but important stories in a subtle way that may lead the movie to be misunderstood as lacking character development. If you haven't seen the movie, just be aware that a pretty even division of focus among several characters means that The Avengers doesn't really serve as a full sequel to any of the solo films, but is a suitable bridge to the characters' next stories, as well as a nice beginning to them being a real team. The action, as expected, is pretty awesome. There are several good action scenes throughout the movie, but the final battle is just in a league of its own. Not only is it on a very large scale, but there are several very cool moments within the battle that show that it was pretty carefully planned out. The fight choreography as a whole is pretty great. The higher power level characters all have some displays of their abilities on par or better than what is seen in their solo films. Black Widow and Hawkeye's hand-to-hand fighting skills are on a believably human level that's still cool to watch, and of a quality similar to that found in a blockbuster spy or action movie. Last but not least, Captain America is much more fun to watch in action this time. Fans who were somewhat disappointed in the depiction of his fighting the first time around will be much more satisfied this time. He's strong, he's agile, and he's definitely skilled. The effects are great, but just a little bit inconsistent. I thought the CGI for the Hulk and the Chitauri was pretty solid, but the effects used to create what we saw of the Chitauri world in the opening scene were not quite on par with the rest of the movie. While on the whole the final battle looked pretty great, there was one segment in which the camera travels around to different Avengers that stood out as having a particularly stylistic and unrealistic look. Even so, it was very fun to watch. As many have said, the comedy was also great. I actually swallowed my gum when I was taken off guard by a certain joke involving a bet. One of the best things about the movie's humor is that ability to take the audience by surprise. The setups aren't obvious, so there are several points when you're not really expecting an attempt at humor, and the movie delivers a good laugh. It's also worth noting that Robert Downey Jr. wasn't forced to be the only actor providing comic relief. Tony Stark likes to joke around, and Downey is great at delivering witty dialogue, but the script has comedic moments for almost every character that seem fitting. I disagree with those who have claimed that the movie is too comedic. While there is an abundance of comedy throughout, it maintains its quality and never takes away much from the drama. In fact, I believe it helps to highlight the seriousness, because when the audience has gotten comfortable and thinks that everything is just light and fun, the transition into something dark, serious, and somber is quite jarring, so that it possibly has even more of an impact than if the majority of the film was more serious. The most significant point of contention over the quality of the Avengers will probably be the story. Like I noted in a recent article of mine, many have complained that the film's plot is too simple. I'll admit that the Avengers isn't exactly an amazing story on its own. I believe that to fully appreciate it, audiences should see the previous Marvel Studios movies so they can understand the place of the Avengers within the context of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Over the past few years, Marvel has begun to build up a fantasy world of connected movies in a way that no one has ever done before. The Avengers is the answer to those wondering if this was a good idea and if they could pull it off. It's not just a gimmick that plays off hype or coasts on the popularity of its characters, but a respectable movie. The plot isn't full of twists and turns, but the movie does a very good job of taking us through its straightforward story in a way comparable to classics like Die Hard. There are very few movies that can match the Avengers when it comes to pure entertainment, and for that reason I think it's very deserving of the praise that it's been given. At this point I'm going to get into a very spoiler-heavy analysis of some of the events of the movie, so if you haven't seen it yet, definitely stop watching now. While there wasn't a lot of heavy drama going on, I do want to take a look at a few scenes that stood out to me. First, I think the death of Agent Coulson was handled very well. While not heartbreaking, things were definitely somber. Although Coulson was a familiar face, the audience was just getting to know him better, the same way the Avengers were. In that way, the movie managed to make me feel like I understood the feeling of loss the Avengers were experiencing. Showing his almost childlike admiration of Captain America gave the character a greater warmth and innocence that we hadn't seen in his previous appearances, which helped to make his death more emotional. One scene that may be somewhat overlooked is the exchange between Steve Rogers and Tony Stark after the death of Coulson. I believe this was a very crucial scene to the story this movie told about these characters. You see Tony fighting to deny his grief by hiding under his jokes and feigned indifference, with comments like he was a cellist and he was an idiot. Tony's words aren't exactly respectful or mournful. However, as Steve approaches Tony, we're able to see that there are tears in Tony's eyes. As much as he wants to reject this emotion and pretend like he's not affected, Tony really is very saddened by the loss of Coulson. When Steve asks him if this is the first time he has lost a soldier, it recalls the scene after the loss of Bucky in Captain America: The First Avenger. Steve blames himself, but Peggy tells him that if he respected his friend, he should honor his sacrifice. It seems that this is the mindset Steve takes in regard to Coulson's death. He's saddened, but he doesn't question Coulson's actions. Tony in his grief is more like the younger Steve, questioning why things had to be this way, and looking for somewhere to place his frustration. He remarks that Coulson should have waited instead of trying to take on Loki. When Steve tells him that sometimes there isn't a way out, it's very likely that some part of Tony remembers Yinsen, the man who saved Tony's life by suddenly rushing into a situation that he couldn't handle. This is probably a turning point in the relationship between Steve and Tony, because here Steve finally is able to see that Tony actually does care about more than just himself. The last scene I wanted to take a look at is the exchange between Tony Stark and Bruce Banner. While they're both very intelligent, these two are opposites in many ways. Tony has everything, Bruce has nothing. Being Iron Man is fun for Tony, while having the Hulk inside him is a curse for Bruce. In Iron Man, Tony tells Pepper that he shouldn't be alive, and that he believes he lived for a reason. Similarly, in the Avengers, Tony tells Bruce that the amount of gamma radiation that he was hit by should have killed him. Bruce is skeptical, but understands that Tony is suggesting that in a way, the Hulk saved Bruce's life, so it isn't quite the curse that he thinks it is. By the end, Bruce seems to have come closer to accepting Tony's philosophy that he survived so that he could use his condition to serve a greater purpose. Since this is pretty applicable to Steve as well, maybe he could have been in the room listening to the conversation so we could see his reaction to this. Anyway, that wraps up my video review for the Avengers, but please check out my written version. It's more detailed and in-depth, and I think it's a better representation of my thoughts. But thank you very much for watching. If you like what you saw, please like, comment, subscribe, and tune in next.